We we're on air. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Um, Thanks for having me. Um, I'm not used to doing virtual talks after the Corona period. I had enough of e-meetings, and I try to avoid them as much as possible. But I made an exception for this one. Jean had been asking a couple of times. So before we start, a couple of very quick, um, I guess, marketing hints. Um, I should be coming to New York City on 17th of October for a LESS course. Looking forward to that. Then in September, there's the LESS conference in Berlin, which I'm excited for it already. And then this talk is called Maximizing Dependencies with Interdependent Teams, and I'll be using some slides, and the slides will be also available on the LESS site on this particular page. So if you go to the events, then there will be an event for this one, and you'll be able to find the slides there. Okay, so with that, maximizing dependencies with interdependent teams. So I've done this talk quite a few times already, and I like it a lot because it shows it's a good introduction to LESS, and at the same time shows some of the deeper dynamics, I guess. But it originally started kind of as a response to the rest of the industry, where people constantly said agile development works well, but we need to have independent teams that work in isolation from the other teams, and that's a good idea. And originally, I also thought it was a good idea many years ago, and after a while, I stopped thinking that and considered that you don't want to really have independent teams, at least not the way people are trying to create them. So therefore, this is a little bit a reaction of other suggestions that I don't agree with. Now, one of the things I've learned for a couple of years already is that one of the best ways of giving presentations and talks is to try to maximize storytelling. And that's what I'm going to do in this talk also. So I'm going to start off with a very short story. Then about 1/4 of the talk will be a story that I'll explain in a moment, how it was created. And then about three-quarter of the talk will be kind of explaining the story and what you need to do in order for you to be able to work in the way as I suggest. But to start with, I'd like to share a story that I like a lot, and kind of shows also the power of storytelling. And this is a story of by now about 10 years ago, when I lived in Singapore, and at that time I have a son. I still have a son, but at that time he was a lot younger, and he was getting his swimming lessons. Um, and at some point we're driving back from his swimming lessons, and we're stuck in traffic, and he's sitting, young kid, in the back of my car, and we're stuck in traffic, and suddenly he says to me, "Papa, I want to go faster." So I said to him, "Well, it's nice you want to go faster, but we're stuck in traffic, and we can't pass them, so we're going at this speed." And then suddenly he looked at the other side of the road, and he pointed to the other side of the road, and he said, "But they are going faster." So I said, "Yeah, they're going faster, but they're actually going in the wrong direction." Right? We have a choice here. We can either go a little bit slower in the right direction, or we can go really fast in the wrong direction. So I asked him, "What do you want to do?" So he thought about it a bit, and he said, I want to go really fast in the wrong direction. Now, when that happened, I just thought this is an amusing story. But then, I came home that evening, and then suddenly I realized that this story, very simple, describes exactly what I experience in our industry most of the time. When working with organizations, many organizations are very focused on productivity, velocity, going faster, but not very focused on going in the right direction. And I hope with less we can also change that a little bit and focus much more on going on the right direction than productivity, velocity, and things like this. Now, when using storytelling, like the short story I just mentioned, one story often has one good point. And similar with my experiences, each experience has one point, makes one point very well. And for this talk, I wanted to try to combine them. And in order to do that, I decided to make up a story, but then one that is basically the combination of a lot of experiments. And then it would be good to visualize that, and it's hard to visualize a story with real people. So I decided to use Lego mini figures to try to visualize a story that is basically just a combination of different experiences. And this was a great opportunity then, because then I could put all of the minifigures together again together with my son. But unfortunately, his patience was 5 minutes, and it took about 2 days to put all of these figures together. So eventually, I spent all my time on that alone. But that's what I'm going to start with in this talk. I'm going to share a lesson option of 5 different teams and talk about how they work together. And the teams that we have here, you can see them on the slide. You'll need to be able to recognize them. Yes,
Awesome.
Gene?
Apologies. I'm afraid you're not advancing. We're still seeing the large less. So you probably,
That is very strange.
You just need to put like a dynamic things, or just share your screen. It happens with Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
so you spoke through the certified licensed practitioner in October, and I see the
Yep.
badge as a small icon, but it didn't pop up as a large main screen. So you're probably a few slides in.
Do you have 2 monitors, Bas, and the show is on a different screen and we're just seeing the
Let me try this.
slide?
That's
There
it.
we go. Perfect.
There we go. So this is what you've been staring at.
Yeah.
And this one you've missed.
And you should be staring at that.
That's a little more like it. There we go.
And this one you've missed also. I've been looking at them though. And this is the site that I mentioned. That's the title. We'll do a fast forward. This is the beginning about stories. We'll get there. And there we talk about the different teams. Now we're good then, Gene?
Yes, we are. And folks, I request for everyone to keep your mics off. I keep doing this for you. Kindly, please do so for yourselves. Thank you. Bas, please go on.
Yes. So you'll need to recognize the teams, and there's 5 teams, as I mentioned. And in the story, you need to recognize which of the people belong to which of the teams. Some of them are relatively easy. So if you look at the criminals, they look like criminals. The team power look kind of like police people. The team lake is people in bathing suits. So those are easy. The two harder ones is the team space, which are space-ish people that kind of still look like people, and then the team Halloween are people that don't look like people anymore. And that's kind of how you can try to distinguish between them. Now we also need a product, of course, and the product that these teams are working on is similar as a product I've worked on a couple of years ago, which is a product for helping universities manage courses and the rest of the university or any kind of educational institute. And here we see the top of the product backlog. And what we see in the top of the product backlog is how a typical backlog actually looks like, which is we have all small items. So each of these items can easily be finished within one sprint. However, the items, many of these items belong to kind of a larger theme. So if we look at viewing courses, course registration with invoice, course registration through payment provider, they relate to a larger theme or a larger feature related to being able to register to courses when you are not actually registered to this particular educational system. Because originally they would give mostly courses to people that are registered, but they want to open it up more to the public. Then there's a couple of others, such as migrate main page to new tech and migrate menus to new tech, which are smaller items related to a technology change. And then there's the basic integration of external scheduler, external schedule support for new time zones. These are smaller items that relate to integrating a third-party software within this product. Right? So what we see here basically is that we have 3 larger features or 3 larger themes: the registration without an account, the upgrade to new technology, and the external scheduler. And these bigger themes or items have been in the past, in the refinement, being broken down. And after they're broken down, they can kind of merged into one list. So therefore, you'll see that some items belong to one and some items belong to another, etc., etc., etc. So these 5 teams are working on it. And the first event that they're working in a less way. In the first event that they're having, so the sprint starts. First event that they're having is called Sprint Planning 1. And Sprint Planning 1 roughly has 2 goals. The first goal is for the teams to select which item they are going to work on. And the second goal is for the teams to figure out how to help each other during this sprint. Now, what you see on the picture is they use a typical technique, which in less we call put the cards on the table. So we see a big table here, and these white blocks are the cards. Those are basically the product backlog items that are printed out on smaller cards and then put into priority order. Then we have the teams standing around them. In this case, we have one team representative standing around them, with the rest of the teams standing behind the representative. And the teams are going to now have a conversation with each other about which item can best be picked up by which of the teams. Now, it might seem that it would be the best, if you think about these larger themes, for one of the teams to pick up all of the items related to the larger themes, right? And that's kind of how most teams start with that idea, because then the teams can work more independently. But that's not how the teams work here, because the teams know that, and it's much more fun to work together, and they'll need to spread the knowledge of different items of parts of the products a bit further, and they'll need to take into account the items that are coming in the future also. So what's happening here is that the criminals team, they've worked on this course registration in the past already. So they're looking at the product backlog, and the top item on the product backlog is an item related to the course registration. So the criminals team, the representative, they have a conversation, and he says, I think it's best for us to pick the top item of the backlog because we know most about this. We've worked on this feature before. We understand the components where we need to make this change. So we would like to pick up this top item. The other team members, the other teams agree with it. However, the Lake team representative says, well, that's okay, especially for the most important item. However, if we look at the product backlog, we see a lot of items related to courses, course registrations, etc., coming in the future. So it's not very good for one team to have most of this knowledge. So it seems like now is an opportunity to spread that knowledge a little bit further. We have a lot of items related to course registration. Let's try to spread them out over the teams. So therefore, the Lake team asks the criminals team, if we look at the backlog, which of these registration items are hard and which ones are relatively easy, so that the teams can get used to course registration also. So the criminals teams look at the top of the items and they say, well, the course registration, the invoice, and the without pay canceling, those are relatively trivial, and the payment provider is a bit harder. Right, so the Lake team says, okay, we'll take the course registration and the cancellation, and the Power team says, oh, and then we'll take the what was it? The invoice generation of the course registration, and then 3 teams together will work on these course registration items, right? And then the space and the Halloween team start listening to this conversation, and they're saying, okay, seems like it's not necessary for all of us to learn course registration this sprint. We've been working on the scheduler and this new tech upgrade already this sprint. So we'll be picking up some of those items and dividing them over the space and Halloween team. So what's happening is they make sure they're not selecting one of the larger themes always to the same team, but they're spreading them a little bit out over that. And they're helping each other by, for example, giving the easier items to teams that are newer on this. Now, what you see here is a way that I've seen sprint planning one happen every now and then, which is the teams are having a discussion within and cross team, while at the same time the different team representatives are talking about the main conversation about which team is going to pick up which item. Now, during this talk also, you'll see the product owner regularly. It's the guy with the red hat and the coffee mug. He's always the guy with the red hat and the coffee mug. And you can see his responsibility in Sprint Planning 1 also, which is not very much, because it's mostly a conversation between the teams, and the product owner is always there, and of course there's only one product owner per product and not one product owner per team. I don't know how people ever got to the idea that that's a good idea. So you have one product owner per product, and he's made the vision the priority, and whenever there's questions about priority or vision, he's there. But most of the Sprint Planning 1 is just between the teams. Now, the output of their Sprint Planning 1, as I mentioned, is that the Criminals, Lake, and Power team, they're taking most of the course registration, and then the new tech and the external scheduler are mostly taken by the space and the Halloween team. But now each team has their own items that they're going to focus on in the next sprint, and therefore they move to sprint planning 2. But what you see here is the first part of sprint planning 2. And again, you see all of the teams standing here again. This thing over here is a very large whiteboard, or my attempt to make a whiteboard with Lego. And we see all of the team members in front of it. Now, what they're doing here is they're having an architectural design session, but a very short one, and they have one basically every sprint planning. Because each of the teams, they have their own items, but the items are strongly connected to each other, and they're very likely to touch similar parts of the system. So therefore, on the whiteboard, they're just drawing roughly a diagram of what their product looks like. And then each of the teams picks up the items that they're going to work on, and they're kind of marking on the architectural diagram where they're likely to make change during this sprint. Now, obviously, the Lake Power and Criminals team, the teams that picked all the course registration items, they'll talk a lot about the parts of the system that they need to change. But there's also some interesting surprises that come up often in this session. So, for example, if we go back to the backlog, we have the course registration through a payment provider. And of course, a payment provider is an external part that needs to be integrated within their system. Also, they have the basic integration with an external scheduler, the name already suggested, which is also related to accessing internal applications. Now, of course, part of the system is a layer between the internal application and the external application. So therefore, now the teams discover that during this sprint, there will be changes in that layer between internal and external, both by the teams focusing on the course registration and the teams focusing on the external scheduler. So they talk a little bit about which team is going to make which change, so that they can avoid making changes multiple times, or doing different solutions at the same time, or things that happen when you don't talk to each other. Now, so after this, the teams, this usually takes only about 30 minutes. It's not very hard. And after this, now the teams know the items that they're going to work on, and they roughly know where in the system they're going to work on in this sprint, and which other teams are going to work in similar parts of the system. So then they'll move to the main part of sprint planning 2. And basically, this is just exactly the same as in Scrum. Now we see that all of the teams are standing behind their own whiteboard, and basically they're doing their own sprint planning. We still see the cards on the table, but they're not actively used. So now each of the teams does their own sprint planning. However, one of the things we'll see here, the Power and the Lake people, they're having a cross-team conversation, right? So they do their own sprint planning just like in Scrum, but it's in the same space and at the same time, because they will have shared work on similar components. So they'll need to have a short discussion on that, on deciding which team is most likely going to make which particular change. So that's what you see here in the between the Power and the Lake teams, where they have a very quick sync up about, hey, are you likely going to make this change, or are we going to make this change? And they'll make sure that they'll plan according to that. You'll also see here the space team. They are actually using a computer during their sprint planning, mostly to check things, which sometimes happens, to make sure that you know what kind of changes you need to make this sprint. Sometimes you'll need to have a look at how it is now, or where something is located, or something like that. And obviously, you see the product owner being super engaged in this entire conversation again. So after the sprint planning, the teams work, and they work in a real office. This is just their day-to-day work in their office space. So here you can see that each of the table is just one team. So this is also my kind of my favorite definition of collocated teams is a team per table. So we have the power table and the criminals table, the lake table, the space table, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of the things you'll see here is, of course, a lot of pairing. Most people are pairing, or discussions around whiteboards, or things like that. We see the product owner drinking coffee in the back of the room also. Also, we see this, emergent conversations across multiple teams. So here the lake and the power and the space team are having a conversation simply by turning their chair and having a conversation. Also, the pairing, of course, is not limited to pairing within a team. Here we see the criminals and the lake team doing cross-team pairing, which is quite common because you're working on the same components. So whenever you're, in this case, working on this this external part, or accessing external systems, and it's something that you change cross teams, it's very common to say, hey, you in the other team, let's pair up on this and just make this change together. Now it's the last event, so that they're working in their sprint, and halfway the sprint they'll have their refinement, backlog refinement. Super important event in less adoptions. Usually this is the first thing that I start with when working with teams. Now what we see here is we see the product owner taking a little bit more active role. He's sitting behind the computer, and this is my attempt to make a projector. So he's projecting the product backlog at the moment, and then we see groups here. These are what we sometimes call mixed up groups. Now, key thing to note of the mixed up groups is that they contain at least one person from each team. Right, so if we look here, we have a space, a lake, a power, and Halloween, and then the last team that I forgot the name now. So we have from each of these mixed up groups, they contain one person from each of the teams. So what happened in the beginning of the refinement, the product owner just projected the backlog, and they pick up the first item. And the first item doesn't really matter what item it is. The product owner says, we would like to clarify, split, or estimate this particular item. And then everyone knows that the clarification, splitting, estimation is done in mixed up groups. So then people volunteer, they move to a part of the room, and for usually about a 30-minute time slot, they'll have a conversation about that. When it's done, it's done. They'll say it's done. The item on the backlog typically gets marked as this is refined. When they need more time, then at the end of that, when all of them get together, they summarize the major learnings from their refinement. And if more time is needed, they'll say, hey, we would like to do another 30 minutes on this particular item. Now, the effect of the refinement this way, this typically lasts half a day to full day every single sprint, and the effects of doing the refinement this way is that each of the teams will have at least one person that was deeply involved in the clarifying of the items in the product backlog. And that means that the knowledge of all of the items at the top of the backlog should be spread across all of the different teams. And now in Sprint Planning 1, the teams can truly have the discussion that we talked about earlier, because all of the teams have the knowledge to have that discussion. Also because of the summarizing that happens in the refinement. Therefore, everyone in all of the teams know at least something about all of the items at the top of the backlog to be engaged and involved in this conversation. So doing the refinement this way, and if you wish, and spreads the knowledge, increases the focus on the product, and allows the teams to work together as the way I described earlier. Now, with that, I'm going to end the Lego story, and instead explore a little bit on how can you get this to work, because and that's also what I mentioned already before in our chit chat. When you're actually within this kind of situation, things are relatively obvious and relatively smooth. But in order to get that to work or function within an organization, you'll need to put a couple of things in place, put some structure, adopt some principles, and I'm going over some of those next. The first thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit is what I've now sometimes come to call the 2 journeys that the teams take in their LeSS adoption. And one journey that most people are familiar with, because it's quite common in just basic Scrum, is the journey from being told how to work to actually becoming a self-managing team. It's for most teams, it's still harder than you might think, or than it seems, because what I've noticed is often that people are so used to somebody telling them how to work that even once they start being more involved and getting more control over their own work structure, they'll still at the same time complain about it and try to do as if it's not within their responsibility. And it takes quite a while, I've noticed, to break a team out of that, where they, instead of say, hey, our planning is boring, say, I didn't like our planning, let's change it. Right? And the last statement is what I would expect a self-managing team to do, because they realize it's within their control. And the first statement is a team that doesn't really realize that it's within their control yet. But for most LeSS adoptions, the biggest of the 2 journeys is the one that I now sometimes call programmer to product developer. I don't have better names for these yet, but programmer this roughly refers to how you see your job, and programmer basically means that as a member of a team, you take the attitude that it's my job to write code and somebody else's job to tell me what to do. So I'm not responsible for figuring out what to do. Somebody is responsible for telling me what to do, and then I'll, as a team member, I'll just write the code. I'll just do whatever we need to do to actually implement that. And this is by far the most common attitude that I get from people within organizations before they adopt LeSS. So this is how, if you wish, the individual people look at their job and their responsibility. But if you think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense because the you build a product and you build a product to solve a particular problem for a customer. But the customers or users, they sometimes are aware of the problem that they need solving, but they're not likely to be experts in technology, and therefore they're not likely to be able to tell you exactly what you need to do in the product in order to solve your problem. And in order to figure out what you need to do, it's a combination of the technology knowledge of what is possible and the understanding of the problem, right? And therefore, expecting somebody else to just tell you what to do is I would say, quite unreasonable attitude as a developer. Instead, as a developer, and this is what we then call a product, it's your responsibility to understand your customer domain and the problem you're solving. And then, if you wish, the requirements will not be given to you, but they're a discovery of your customers or users and the developers together trying to find the best solution, the best technical solution, if you wish, to the particular problem that we're trying to solve here. So therefore, the clarification, it needs to be very interactive. You see this you see this most clearly within a refinement. Right? When you're in a refinement and your team is looking at a particular person or persons and saying, okay, tell us what this means and we'll just do that, then you're stuck into this programmer mindset. But you want to move away from that. And if you have a refinement where, as a mixed up group, you're together trying to understand the domain and the problem and seeing the different possibilities of solving that, then you're moving towards a product developer. Most of the teams will need to, in LS adoption, need to go through this journey. For me now, I assume that both of these takes about 6 months at least for people to look at their job and their responsibility differently. Now, the teams who are using less consists of experiments, guides, frameworks, and principles, and we'll go from the principles to the structure to some concrete technical practices. The two key principles that you saw within the story were the whole product focus, where each of the teams, they were not only interested in what their team is going to do the next sprint, but they're interested in the larger product and how they can contribute to the whole product, right? And you see this, for example, in the sprint planning one, that the teams were not trying to grab the work that they wanted to do, but instead the teams are together talking about how can we as the teams together pick up the top of the backlog, right? So therefore, they always put the interest of the whole product ahead of their own team interests. And the second principle we saw is the customer-centric principle, especially in the refinement, like I mentioned earlier, where you move from the programmer to product developer. You'll also need to think a lot more from your end customer's perspective. What problem are we trying to solve here, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we then zoom in a little bit further, structure-wise, one of the things the teams had gone through is the change from component team structure to feature team structure. I think most of you are hopefully aware of the difference, but this is usually one of the 3 large changes that I see when adopting less. And let me make a sidetrack there. The three large changes that I often see are getting rid of product owner per teams, changing from component teams to feature teams, removing functional organizations. Those are typically the three large changes that you start with in a less adoption. But here we're focused on component feature teams, and most organizations are structured around component teams where the teams map to the technical components, the architecture of the system. They're super easy to recognize whenever you have a team where the name of the team relates to what they do, you have component teams. If you print the architecture diagram and the org chart, if there's any similarity between them, you have component teams. So they're usually super easy to recognize. And in most organizations, you can assume that you'll start with component teams. Now, one of the obvious problems of component teams, there's many of them, but the one that I want to highlight here is that if the product backlog has customer-centric items, then the customer-centric items do not fit exactly to one of the teams, right? Because the teams are structured around the architecture, and the customers doesn't think in terms of architecture, but thinks in terms of functionality or problems to solve. So for example, in this particular picture, we see that item 1 requires work from component A team and component B team. And hence we have what we traditionally call dependencies between teams, because the teams will need each other's work for the entire feature to actually work. Now, these dependencies wouldn't really be a problem if the dependencies would balance out equally over the teams, because then they would happen all at the same time. But in practice, that's not what happens. And you can also see this in the way this is drawn, because if you look at item 4, customer-centric item 4, it'll require also changes from component A team, but it also requires changes from component C team. Now, what will happen the next sprint is the component A team will work on item 1, because from their perspective, it's the highest priority. And the component C team will work on item 4, because from their perspective, that's the highest priority. But in order to finish the whole of item 4, it will also require work from component A team, and the component A team will not work on it this sprint because from their perspective, it's not the highest priority, right? So now what will happen is component C team will do their part of this feature, leave it half done, integrated, and then a couple of sprints later, component A will do their part of this feature, try to integrate it with the work that component team C did a couple of sprints ago. And of course, that never works. So then component team A starts interrupting team C, and team C will be annoyed about this because from their perspective, they've completed this a couple of sprints ago already. They're working on something completely different now. Now, what is happening here, and that's the key message that I want to bring during this talk also, is that these dependencies are what we sometimes like to call asynchronous dependencies, right? So dependencies themselves is actually not really a problem. Most of the skilled agile thinking considers dependencies between teams to be a problem. Again, I used to think so too, changed my mind on that. Dependencies are not a problem, but asynchronous dependencies are a problem. So asynchronous dependencies is what you see here, which is an item requires work from 2 teams, but because of the difference in priority, the teams will not work on it at the same time. and because they don't work on it at the same time, it will cause a conflict between these teams. I have a question from Jeff. Is it short?
Yes, there's a few questions in chat here that are interesting to see about team topologies, specifically around platform teams and how that works with decoupling into loosely coupled business problems and capabilities.
That is not a short question, and I'll leave it till after the talk, hopefully in about 10 minutes. Will that be okay, Jeff?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Although the short answer is clearly it is not compatible, but I'll give a longer answer later to that. So we have these asynchronous dependencies between teams, and as I mentioned, asynchronous dependencies that causes a conflict. Now, unless there's one preferred team structure, which we call feature teams, and feature team simply means that you take a customer-centric item, give it to one team, and the team is responsible for the entire item, independent of where you need to make changes within the system. So here we have item 1, which goes to one team, item 2 to another, item 3 to another, and team Wei, Shu, and Wu can now work independently from each other. Now, they can, but they have a different kind of dependency, because if we compare these two pictures, we see that the dependencies have actually moved, because now each of the teams potentially will work in similar components. Now, this is not really a problem, but I want to point out that these dependencies are very different kind of dependencies than the dependencies we talked about between component teams. So, for example, if Wei and Shu are making a change in component A, then they only have a dependency when they need to make a change at the same time. And if Team Wei makes a change in sprint 1 and Team Shu makes a change in sprint 3, of course, Team Shu needs to work on top of the work that another team did earlier. But other than that, they don't really have a dependencies between each other. Right? So therefore, these dependencies are always synchronous. Team Wei and Shu only have a dependency when they need to make a change within that component at the same time. Now, we call these kind of dependencies synchronous dependencies. And synchronous dependencies have a very different effect on the teams and team dynamics. Because one of the things that happens now is that because Wei and Shu make a change at the same component at the same time, they are within the same context. There's no interruption or context switch, and it becomes beneficial from both of these teams to actually collaborate with each other. So therefore, these kind of dependencies actually promote cross-team collaboration rather than interrupts, which is what the asynchronous kind of dependencies lead to. So to summarize that, we have asynchronous dependencies that lead to interrupt and conflict, and synchronous dependencies that lead to collaboration across teams. So it's not the dependencies that is a problem, it is the kind of dependencies that is a problem. And we try to, instead of solving a particular kind of dependencies, we try to eliminate, we as in the community, try to eliminate all of the dependencies by creating independent teams. Now, of dependencies, the main problem, let me go to the next one, the main problem of dependencies is the depending on problem, the being blocked, as in we cannot proceed without the other team doing something kind of dependency, right? Because those dependencies lead to frustration, right? But we also use the phrase dependency when people are working in the same part of the system, right? But these dependencies are very, very different kind of dependencies than the depend on or being blocked kind of dependencies. So blocking dependencies, again, not good, but non-blocking dependencies, which in LESS we often refer to as shared work, they again promote cross-team collaboration and are not really a problem. So when we talk about maximizing dependencies, we don't want to maximize blocking asynchronous dependencies between teams, because we know those cause conflict, and that's the experience most people have. But we want to maximize the synchronous shared work kind of dependencies, because those actually enable cross-team collaboration. Now, another aspect of feature teams that is often people miss is that being in feature teams tend to be a lot more fun, because you have a lot more choice in what you do as a team. And if you're in a, say, a backend component team, the work you'll get is backend work. You have no choice. It's already predefined that you're going to work on a particular type of work. Within feature teams, you are still constrained to the work that you do based on priority and product backlog. But within the top of the backlog, you're quite free to choose what kind of work you'd like to do and like to learn. Of course, that choosing does go into a collaboration with the other teams, which we saw in the teams happening in the sprint planning one. But it allows you and your team to have much more, if you wish, freedom on the kind of work that you'll be working on. Another thing that will happen, and you also heard that within the story, is that sometimes people say, oh, but this means that all of the teams need to know everything. Also not true. If you listen to the earlier story, it started off with these course registration, and we had one team that had worked there mostly before. They were clearly the expert. They'd worked on those type of features earlier, and therefore they also knew the components related to course registration. Now we call this accidental specialization. Right? They are not purposely specialized on certain components, but because they pick up certain features, therefore accidentally they become the experts within certain components. And if you think back on the story again, the criminals team was the main expert related to course registration. The teams together looked at the backlog and said, hey, a lot of things are coming related to course registration. In other words, continuing to just have one team knowing a lot about that is likely going to create bottlenecks in our future. Let's start collaborating on this by having the items spread out between the different teams. And spreading out the items between the different teams is what we call maximizing dependencies, because there the teams are purposely creating dependencies between the teams to enable the cross-team collaboration. Doesn't mean that every team can do everything. You will still have accidental specialization. I'll skip a couple of these slides. Now, if we dive a little bit deeper, we'll get to the more technical side of things. One of the hardest things for most teams I work with is for developers to start working more incrementally. This slide is it looks like such a simple slide, but in practice, this is such a big change for individual developers to stop trying to do big tasks all at once and then integrate them when the tasks are done, but instead trying to constantly break everything into small incremental changes that still keep the entire system working and continuously integrating those changes, right? And thus, continuous integration is a key technical practice that is really super important in LESS adoptions. And of course, I don't mean an automatic built-in test, but I mean constantly integrating small changes on mainline, right? No pull requests, no branches, just integration on mainline. Now, the aspect that often people miss on continuous integration is that continuous integration is also a very social team practice, because it allows teams to continuously integration basically means continuously sharing your work across all of the different teams, right? So therefore, it enables much closer collaboration within and across the teams, especially when multiple people from different teams are working on similar components. Nowadays, one of the common practice, let me take a step back. One of the common practices has always been what we call in less communicating code, which means you actually use the different commits and check-ins to see where the other teams are working on. Now, nowadays, that's a lot easier by simply linking your version control system to your chat. In the picture that you see here is Teams, where whenever you have a channel per component, whenever you're working in a particular component, you join the channel, and every change or commit automatically gets pushed to that channel. So this is a screenshot of a product that I worked a couple of years ago. And in this case, whenever you made a change in this student mobile component, you would join the Teams chat, and whenever another person made a change, you get a plop-up message in your chat. Somebody's making a change in this component. You're working there at the same time, so you have a quick look on whether it's the same part. If yes, you'll drop them a message. If no, you might do a quick 1 minute post commit review, but otherwise you'll move on, and at least you're aware that the other teams are actively working on the same place as you are at that time. Don't branch, and pull requests are branches. And then as last of the technical practices that I want to mention is that this closer collaboration also means that many small code repositories is not recommended within LESS. Instead, there's a preference to mono repositories, which is one repository for the entire product or even for the entire company. There's nothing new about this. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Uber are known to have adopted mono repositories. There's a lot of things published about Google's mono repositories. Facebook recently released their own version control system that allows mono repositories, and that's definitely a practice that I would recommend in LESS adoptions, because it makes the cross-team collaboration a lot easier. So with that, it's already 5 minutes past 7 here. Talk called maximizing dependencies with interdependent teams. To quickly summarize, maximizing dependencies here refers to the teams not trying to isolate their work, but purposely selecting similar items to different teams, because the teams like working together during the sprint, because they know the dependencies are not blocking dependencies, not asynchronous dependencies, and therefore they enable collaboration between the teams rather than interrupts. With maximizing dependencies, we also don't want independent teams, but we want the teams to very actively collaborate and learn from each other during the sprint. And with that, a reminder that we have a course coming up in October, and there were a bunch of questions also. Jeff, do you want to? Are you still here? No.
Boss, as I suggest, this is Gene. Those that have questions, just raise your hand and yell out for the sake of time.
Yes. There's a lot on chat that I didn't have time to read all of it,
Yeah.
so I prefer if people can raise their hand and speak.
Indeed.
Yes, Ignacio.
Hi. Yes, I asked about the team topologies, Stream-aligned and platform teams. How is
Yes.
the relationship with the component teams or feature?
So the team topologies, the way I look at the team topologies work is a step backwards and not very compatible with a less way of thinking. The team topologies suggests that teams need to own particular parts of the system, which in less we call component teams, and they lead to dependencies, blocking dependencies between teams. I would not recommend using team topologies together with less, but I wouldn't recommend using team topologies at all.
Thank you.
Mark.
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, this is fantastic. Thank you very much. So I've done this in the past, and we got to a point where the team said, we can't, the cognitive load is too much, right? Like we can't work on any component in the system. There's just too much to understand there, either from the technical side or from the business side. Have you run into that? And what do you do in that situation? Do you split them into separate programs, each with a subset of the components or something? Or what do you suggest?
Frankly, I have not run into that situation.
Okay.
And I am still a bit confused on why or how that would happen. Right? Because it is up to the teams themselves, which picks up which of the items. It is a discussion between the teams on figuring out how to learn from each other. And as a team, it's always your choice how much items you can pick up. So I wouldn't understand when a team would say, we can't handle the load. I mean, the load suggests that items are pushed to teams.
Cognitive load. So in other words, the system got too big and complex for people to be able to just jump into any component and understand it well enough, right? From sprint to sprint, jumping around on different components. They just felt like it got too complex for them to be able to work on anything anywhere within this growing, system.
Which is not what I suggested, although I don't see it as a problem. But again, the teams together talk about which team works on which items.
Okay.
So if we go back to the, sorry, that was forward there, and a key thing that happens is accidental specialization, which is that particular teams like working in particular parts of the system more, and whenever there's features related to those particular components, they might, again, in the sprint planning, say, hey, we love working on the app, and there's features on the app. Do you guys mind if we pick them up? And
okay.
it's a decision between the different teams.
Mm-hmm. Right? I would sure, and in this example, I wasn't around long enough to see if if teams eventually drifted into component teams because they tended to, right, favor one particular component or another by choice rather than by assignment.
But you can't move to component teams because it will depend on the priority on your backlog.
Right. Okay.
Right, so the next sprint, there's no app work. So the team that prefers the working on the app component they talk to the other teams and they say, we love working on the app component. there's no work on the app component this sprint.
Right.
Which feature do you guys think will be good to start working on components that we don't know very well, right? And that's a collaboration between the teams. And as long as that collaboration between the teams is there, I've never seen this concept of cognitive load come up. It only comes, I can only imagine that when the scope is forced and the teams are forced somehow to work across the different system without having that cross-team collaboration.
Okay.
It's the exact opposite. That's what we're proposing.
Okay. All right. That's a good food for thought. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Anu.
Hey, hi, Vas. Thank you so much for giving us a tour of LESS in such a creative way. And also, I really love your storytelling technique. And I will remember it for the rest of my life, that story, the way you said it, right? That was the point, I guess. So for this one, I had a questions like I have these questions for a long, like in the backlog refinement, right? When we write the stories and acceptance criterias, how detailed we should go. Like what is your suggestion? Like so for example, we have a story that we have to get access to a particular resource. It's a very technical in nature. You need to create some RSAM, stuff like that. So how much detail we should put in the story, that how we are going to achieve that task, or what is the end goal?
So I like to then point back to this slide, completely up to the teams.
Okay.
Right, that the
It's up to the
teams
team.
will add, when the sprint starts, they need to remember what they talked about in the refinement.
Okay.
Some teams have a very good memory and they remember everything. Most teams that I worked with do not have a very good memory. And they'll need to have a discussion about what are we going to document? How are we going to remember that? And that's a discussion for the teams.
So then if that is the case, then in succession to that question, so if we have multiple skills in team like UX, we have research, we have, so if developer tends to get more in detail, then that conversation is not very useful for other people, right? So they do not understand that how that time is being added, it's adding any value to them.
And in LESS, as in Scrum, in a team, you have team members and you don't have particular roles. So whenever a particular person is thinking, why is this relevant from my functional skills perspective? Then you have work to do on your team, because within the team, you don't have
We should
fixed
not have.
functional skills.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Igor?
Yeah, so my question is, what is the good for LESS, and how is good LESS for agile transformation? Maybe you have some good cases. So I will be really interesting to hear some cases, maybe from Singapore, maybe from any other Europe countries, and cultural aspects as well, how good it's fit for a cultural stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try to share something else. See, I'm not sharing anything right now, right? Let's see if this works. Share, you'll see my browser with the LESS site, correct?
Yep.
There's the case studies menu. And there's a bunch of case studies that you can find there. Most of them are very long, and I recommend reading through them. If you don't like reading case studies, then on YouTube, I think you can find it in the learning resources videos also. Should have it here? No. Oh, it is on the less.
Maybe top cases that you would like us to check and visit, so we can go through them and get some real cases on transformation.
Well, these are all real cases, and it depends on the kind of industry, size, etc.
Maybe heavy industry like gas, oil, etc.
Okay. So what is specifically interesting in those industries?
Well, how good is it fitted with less? Because I had some experience work with that industries on agile transformation. We used Spotify model, and it was really hard to make it to fit with a cultural aspect.
With the
It
cultural
was a challenge. Yeah, it was a challenge.
Okay. I recommend to just look at the case studies because I think in order to give a broader recommendations, we would need to go into the what was a challenge earlier, and I think for now we don't have enough time for that.
Yeah, sure.
Also, the YouTube LESS channel. There's on the LESS conference every year. There's a LESS conference. I think half of those tend to be experience reports from different industries. So I'd recommend looking at that. Ignacio.
Okay, thank you.
Ignacio.
Yeah, if it's time for another question.
It is.
So just question about the product owner. We want one product owner, but this becomes challenging when you have many teams. So when is a good reference of teams, number of teams to start thinking of scaling the product owner, and how many teams per product owner?
So in LESS, you have in basic LESS, which is up to 8 teams, you always have just one product owner. If you have more than 8 teams, then you'll get to less huge. And then there's a way of having multiples of 8 teams per area, and an area has then their own product owner.
Thank you.
It's as long as the product owner focuses mostly on prioritization and visioning, right? The product owner's responsibility for me is to make sure that all of the people understand the vision of the product and are passionate on building that, and they understand the prioritization of the backlog. The product owner doesn't create stories, clarify all the details, make acceptance criteria, and any of that. That's not what product owners should do, not in Scrum, not in LESS.
Very quickly, boss. I want to be cognizant of your time. Let me know if you are still good going a little longer, or do you want to go feed your baby?
I'm good so far. As I mentioned, at some point my children will get hungry.
Okay. Your role.
Edwin.
Hi, Bas. I did the course with you 5 years ago in Amsterdam because I'm Dutch. So actually, I am inspired by the work of LESS since then. Nevertheless, I noticed that a lot of companies choose the, let's say, the quite opposite framework, the safe one. I didn't mention that one. What would be your suggestion if you're in such an organization, you would still bringing some of the ideas and principles or thoughts about LESS? What is the first item you would start working on in such an organization to make a change?
Most organizations that I see that have adopted things like SAFe, we're looking for a quick solution to certain problems. And whenever that happens, the main thing I would do is try to help the organization understand the problems that they have in their development better, and then ask whether the solution that they've chosen actually solves the problems that they have. And a big tool for that is systems
Yeah,
thinking.
using that
and,
one.
and go see, trying to pull management down to what is actually happening with the teams, so that they understand the day-to-day problems within the organization. Now, my obviously very biased experience is that you quickly realize that SAFe doesn't actually solve any particular problem that the organization has, and that then you can explore in how are we going to do that. And then, I wouldn't recommend to switch to less as the next solution, because then you're back to where the problem that you started with, but instead think about why certain things are the way they are in less, and what of these practices make sense for the problems that your organization has. It takes patience, and sometimes you'll help the organization improve.
I am patient. That's really helpful. For your information, it's the Dutch Railways. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Karen.
Hi, boss. How would you compare the effectiveness of this approach when it's done remotely, hybrid, or in person? Can you?
Sure. I consider co-location to be very important for effective collaboration. I've during the COVID time spent most of my time joining a team as a team member, mostly to see if the same experiences that I've had as a team member of co-located teams, whether I could get that in a pure work from home environment. And after 1.5 years, I've come to the conclusion the answer is no. It's virtually impossible to get that level of interaction within and cross teams.
Well, can they come in like 1 or 2 days a week and do this and then go back home, like a mix?
So from my perspective, it will then be just a trade-off that you'll need to make within your organization. From pure product development perspective, full co-location, in my opinion, is best. Some organizations don't want to go back to 5-day co-located teams anymore, and they choose to have a hybrid way of working, as you mentioned. It's much better than purely 100% remote. So that's just the trade-off that your organization makes at that time. When you do that, make sure that all of the teams are in the office at the same time.
Okay.
Because one of the things that I've seen organizations do is that different teams choose different in-office days. And at that point, you're optimizing your in-team collaboration, but your cross-team collaboration will actually suffer from that. So then it would be better to say, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Tuesday, Thursday are office days. Then we expect all of the people to be there and the other days not. And then you'll get at least close to the same dynamic as co-location. In my experience, it's still not the same, but that's again the trade-off you'll make related to people's expectation on the employer, etc.
Okay, thank you.
The world that we're living today.
I have a very quick comment on that. A lot of answers, the answer for some leaders is, oh, well, everybody in the US needs to come into the office, but because we have developers in low cost locations, they can work. They don't perceive that as, they perceive that differently. We're not only dealing with time zone challenges, the difference in time zone, but also this perception that in office means for the US, and remote gets a pass because they're a low cost location. Just something, to think about.
And what location are you referring to then?
You mean specifically the low cost location?
Yeah, and let me clarify that, because I just spent the last 3 weeks in Asia, and one of the things I noticed in the places that I work was that people were spending much more time in the office again compared to Europe. And in Europe, it's much more compared to my experiences in the US. So therefore, I'm curious which location would go less to the office than in the US.
Well, it was, I would say probably India might be one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And other locations as well. It's just, regardless of where the location is, if there's one location, if it's a globally distributed team, which it's just that if there's going to be one country that comes in face to face, well, the others get a free pass. I'm not sure how that works.
No.
We've struggled with a little bit of that.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, then Jean, I suggest to end it so I can feed my children.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Boss, to you personally for taking the time out of your evening schedule and from your kids, I guess, parental schedule, your parenting schedule. Thank you for doing this. This has been tremendously informative. I'm sure people recognize it, realize it, and thank you very much for doing this. Everyone, thank you very much for joining, whoever's left on the call still. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the patience. And we shall be making this recording available along with the materials in a little bit. We just need some time to digest it. And also, please do not forget about the information that Bas shared about his upcoming course. If you are in New York City in October, you or your colleagues perhaps, or some network friends, please consider a deeper dive into learning the org design, system modeling, and product-centric, customer-focused product development, and all of the above aforementioned topics that Bas shared today. Once again, thank you. Have a good rest of the day. Happy Friday, everyone. We're going to stop recording now.
Thank you.
Wish you all the best. Cheers.
Thank you.